Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to this special session where we are going to talk about all the various different climate conventions and the conference of parties associated with the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, why should you take a look at this session, and why is this session important for you? Now, historically, if you take a look at the prelims exam paper for the past 10 years, you will always find that there is one question in the prelims from either of these conference of parties and the major actions taken during these conference of parties. Now, as a consequence, many students they simply take a look at the recently held conference of parties, but they tend to ignore some of the organizations which have been created on the sidelines of these conference of parties. Well, in this session, not only are we going to cover the entire timeline of all the conference of parties from 1995 all the way till 2025. So all the various 30 conference of parties which have been held, this session is going to cover all of them in. But is the relevance only restricted to the prelims examination? The answer is no. This is a portion which is relevant even for the mains examination. Even in the mains exam, even if you consider the mains examination paper of 2025, you had a question associated with Conference of Parties number 26, which was held way back in 2021. So there are certain Conference of Parties which are considered to be landmark in terms of the achievements, in terms of their outcomes. And that is something which is going to be important for your mains preparation also in the long run if you want to clear the examination and if you want to gain a strong foothold in the portion of environment and ecology. This session is the one stop destination for all of you. After revising and taking a look at this session, you don't need to cover any other material when it comes to the Framework Convention on Climate Change or any of the conference of parties. From that and from there on, you can just keep on updating the current affairs and your job will be more than done. Now, first of all, to start with the basic aspects of it, that what do we mean by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or UNFCCC? So, UNFCCC is the Framework Convention on Climate Change which was arrived at in 1992. So, in 1992, you basically had the Rio Summit or the Earth Summit. Now, this was considered to be one of the major summit meetings across the world when it comes to environmental action, because it was in this summit that major decisions were taken in terms of how to conserve the environment and how to go about in terms of sustainable development. Now, this summit is famous for three different documents which were generated and three conventions which were arrived at. Now, which were the three conventions which were arrived at this Rio summit? So, if you take a look at three conventions, the conventions covered the portion of climate, the overall desertification, as well as the conservation of biodiversity. So, you basically had UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Then, after that, you basically had the Convention on Biological Diversity. It is under this Convention on Biological Diversity that you basically have the Cartagena Protocol, the Nagoya Protocol, all those are included under CBD. And then you have the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. This is something which has been in news again in the recent times, owing to the action which is being taken in the Aravalis, where the danger is that the desertification in northern part of the country will increase because of the mining of the Aravalis as well. So these were three of the major landmark conventions which were arrived at. Now, for those of you who are beginning the preparation and those of you who are not very clear about what a convention is and what a protocol is, in very simple language, understand this, that when you have many people and many different parties, that is, the interested parties who are participants to a particular meeting, now those participants, when they decide on a long term goal, a long term agenda, that is a convention. So, Framework Convention on Climate Change was basically convened and was arrived at in order to achieve the long term climate goals. What were the long term climate goals? to reduce the amount of heating and global warming that the planet is going through. So that is why you had a convention. But then, just setting the long term goals does not help you achieve this. For example, if you set a goal that I will clear the examination in 2026 or 2027, just that goal in itself might not help you achieve it. You need timely targets as well. When will I complete the portion of prelims? When will I start the revision? By when will I complete the first phase of revision? And so on. So that time setting and the small timely agenda actions that you set, that is what is defined by the protocol. So in this UNFCCC, you basically have the Kyoto Protocol, which again is something that we are going to study in detail in this particular session. What were the key components of the Kyoto Protocol? Now here, you might have a question that why only in 1992 was this set? Was there a background to this? There indeed was a background. The background started with 1972 Stockholm Conference. That is when it all started. Now, Stockholm Conference is considered to be the mother of all different conventions and environmental protection. It was not this is not the Stockholm Convention. There's a different Stockholm Convention for persistent organic pollutants. This is the Stockholm Conference. Now, this Stockholm Conference identified triple threats to environment, the triple threats which are posed to the environment. Which were those triple threats? You basically had the threat which was identified as the climate change. Then, the second threat which was identified was basically pollution. And then the third threat which was identified for for the survivability of planet was basically loss of biodiversity. So that is where from Stockholm Conference arose a larger movement for conservation of environment, and there were steps and there were measures being taken in each of these regards as well. So that is the case of the United Nations Framework Convention. Why? Because 1992 marked 20 years since the Stockholm Conference. And exactly on those days, you had the holding of the Rio Summit. So that is why 1992, around 5th June, was chosen. Now, in 1972, you had an organization, an environmental body which was created, that was United Nations Environment Program. This was created in 1972. And this body has been a a front runner, a forebearer, a flag bearer of sorts in terms of determining that what are the climate agendas to be considered, the various reports in order to indicate the emission levels, in order to indicate the adaptation levels, and so on. So UNEP was formed in 1972 itself. Now, another major event happened in 19 preceding the Rio Summit. In 1988, you basically had the formation of IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Now, this was a scientific body which would carry out detailed report in terms of the emissions, what would be the level of warming, the amount of greenhouse gases emitted from which particular portion, where methane is emitted, what is the impact of methane, how the change in the land surface is impacting the amount of heating, the amount of cooling, and so on. So it was a scientific organization, and you had two bodies which were responsible for the formation of IPCC, UNEP, and World Meteorological Organization. These two bodies came together for the formation of IPCC. Now, IPCC tends to generate reports indicating the health of the climate, the health of the planet, and the crisis that the planet is going through. So, the first report, what was referred to as the assessment report number one, that assessment report number one was released in the year 1990 to 91. And that basically told the world that, look, the climate is going through a crisis. And that crisis needs to be taken care of and as urgently as possible. So, all this held the background and held the ideal condition under which the 1992 Rio summit was actually held. Now, this UNFCCC came into force in 1994. So the first conference of party which was held was actually in 1995. And since then, barring the COVID years, it has been held regularly. So that is why you overall have around 30 conference of parties which have been held. Not all of them are very important in terms of the outcomes that they have, but then they are very important in terms of steering the negotiations and, for example, developing certain mechanisms like Red Plus, Global Alliance for Finance, then, for example, Global Methane Pledge. So, all of them have actually arisen from the sidelines of these conference of parties. One by one, let us start with the discussion of each of these conference of parties. But before we take a look at the first conference of parties, which was held in 1995 in Berlin, an announcement for all of you, all those who are interested in preparation for civil services. Now, you don't need to hesitate when to begin. We have come up with a lucrative offer of 55% off and double the validity period. So, whatever is the validity period for your course, it will be double. And you also have CSE Assure, whereby if you have a subscription of 2 years and above, in case you don't clear the examination at the end of it, your next year's preparation is on us. And this is based on the conviction that we have, based on the quality of information and the quality of content that is provided to you on the platform. To avail this, use the code IS English and make your dreams uh, come a bit closer to reality. Now, having said that, now let us come to the portion of these one by one. So it all started in Berlin. Now, at that point of time, and I will give you the background also wherever it is important so that you are able to imagine this, and that is going to help you retain it in a better way. And please understand, many of you will have the temptation to simply download the PDF that we will read it later. You will not be able to retain it. So, understand the background, understand the flow, and that is where you will be able to retain it right now and right here itself so that the revision can also be fruitful. So in Berlin, that is around 1995, 3 years since the convention was agreed upon, there was an increased kind of doubt, a kind of hesitation, and at the same time, restlessness that how do we start with the curbing down of greenhouse gas emissions? Because the convention was clear that look, that if you want to control the temperature rise or global warming, you actually have to limit the emissions which are caused. So that is where the emissions need to be controlled from where? The emissions primarily by the developed nation. So that is where the principle of common but differentiated responsibility was also being discussed about. That all the nations which are emitting, for example, India is also emitting, US is also emitting. But US and India cannot be held at the same pedestal because US has achieved its developmental parameters after those emissions of centuries. Whereas India has started developing in the recent times, and India needs to basically fulfill the requirement of its larger population. Unless and until that population's requirement is not met, what requirement? Energy, power, vehicles, and so on, industries. So, if that requirement is not met, then we will always be left in the entire sector of poor countries. So, we need to develop. So all the countries are responsible for climate, but some countries have a greater responsibility. Those countries who have a historical baggage of emissions. After all, think about it. The global warming which was being caused in the 1990s, was it being led by the emissions from India? Was it being led by the emissions from China? Absolutely not. These were the historical emissions which were already caused by European nations, by North American nations, and the developed nations of the world. So that CBDR was also in question. So it started on a kind of a pensive note, and that is where countries were classified, the countries were grouped. You basically had the Annex 1 countries included developed nations like US, Canada. Then you had the European nations, those who were part of OECD, right? Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, a post Second World War organization of the developed nations of Western Europe and North America, to members of OECD. And also some of the economies in transition. What were these economies in transition? The East European nations and Russia, for example. That is, after the fallout of Soviet Union, you did not have USSR as the giant superpower or developed country anymore. You basically had Russia and some of the countries of Eastern Europe. So all these nations basically, they were ascribed a target. First target was that we will ask you to limit your emissions. Then, after that, we will ask you, in order to help the poorer countries like India, like China, to give them technological means in order to curb the emission, to give them finance in order to adapt to climate change, to give them funding in order to prevent climate change action. So that is where the Annex 1 parties were clubbed together. And what started was referred to as the Berlin Mandate. So this Berlin Mandate is oftentimes referred to with the UNFCCC. This can be relevant for your prelims examination. That Berlin Mandate is associated with which of these conventions? And that is where you can have Convention of on Biological Diversity, Convention on Desertification, Stockholm Convention, and like that. So Berlin Mandate was associated with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Japan, as a country, was also included in this. So the parties agreed to launch a negotiating process to strengthen commitments for the Annex 1 parties and to develop a protocol or any other legal instrument so that the timely goals setting could be done and they could be achieved, right? Now, Annex 1 countries, they include the industrialized countries, which were the member of OECD, plus the countries of EIT, the economies in transition, including the Russian Federation, Baltic states, and several Central and Eastern European nations. Right? So, US, Canada, Japan, Russia, all of them, they were included in Annex 1 countries. Then the Berlin Mandate discussed about that we need to arrive at a protocol. We need to give targets to these Annex 1 countries, that how to limit emissions, where to limit emissions. So, under that backdrop, the Conference of Parties number 2 was held in Geneva, Switzerland. So, this was furthering the discussion about setting up of a protocol, and that was the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol would be arrived at in 1997. We are 1 year prior to the Kyoto Protocol. So at this point of time, intense negotiations were happening. Developed countries obviously were nervous about it. Developed countries were not ready to be a part of any target setting, because now the world would be able to watch them and the world would basically make them accountable. You had strong opposition from countries like US. You had strong opposition from countries like Canada, even today for that matter. Take a look at the action of US, one of the larger emitters in the world. Now, whenever you have Donald Trump coming in, he simply says climate change is a conspiracy and US steps out of the Paris Agreement and so on. So that is where you had a discussion, a tense dialogue. So advanced negotiating texts were finalized on emission targets and the possible scope for any future protocol. That what would the protocol include? For example, I will tell you, one of the key sticking points was that what if I give the target and the country does not meet the target, then what? For example, if I give target to a country A that reduce your emission by 10%, now immediately that country cannot shut down the industries. It will take some time for that country to develop alternatives. So, what do you do in that time period? So, these modalities in before a protocol, that was something which was being finalized in this particular situation. It narrowed the options on flexibility mechanism, carbon sinks, and the compliance which the countries have to adhere to before the further meeting in Kyoto. So, Conference of Parties number one was Berlin Mandate. Conference of Parties number two in Geneva, you had the discussion about what to do in the protocols. And then you had the landmark Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol was very unique. Never before had the world witnessed such a kind of an action. Now, this Kyoto Protocol was adopted in Conference of Parties number 3, which was held in Kyoto in Japan. Now, this Kyoto Protocol basically was about fixing targets for the Annex 1 countries, that beyond this you cannot emit. If you are emitting beyond this, we will not immediately punish you. We will give you options as well. We will give you options regarding how to meet your target. For example, let's suppose as a candidate, you are given a target that in the next 5 days you have to complete the portion of geography. Now, in case you are unable to finish the portion of geography, then maybe you can do one thing, you can appear for other test papers. So you will have some other responsibility that you can fulfill in order to meet the criteria. So that kind of a flexibility mechanism was developed for the first time, which made it easier to follow and which made it quite unique, right? So that is where it was legally binding quantified emission reduction target for the Annex 1 parties. And the implementation plan period was supposed to be 2008 to 2012, 5-year plan period. We are in which time right now? 1997. So the things which were being discussed was for 10 years in the future. Okay, 10 years in the future. Now, this was a single most important legal outcome of the Berlin, Geneva, and Kyoto negotiation. Now, this Kyoto Protocol overall, the countries that would ratify the protocol would commit to reduction of greenhouse gases. Which greenhouse gases? All the greenhouse gases. After all, water vapor is also a greenhouse gas, isn't it? So, which greenhouse gases are we concerned about? So, you have carbon dioxide and five other greenhouse gases: methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, and perfluorocarbons. These were initially targeted. That you have to limit the restriction of these six greenhouse gases. Out of these, the most dangerous would be carbon dioxide and methane emission. Mind you, per molecule, when you consider the amount of damage, carbon dioxide has got a lot of damage. Methane has got greater warming potential as compared to one molecule of carbon dioxide. It has got a greater warming potential. But then, methane as a gas does not stay in the environment for very long. It dissociates and it disintegrates very quickly. But nonetheless, it is one of the major greenhouse gases, right? So that is where engage if you are not able to curb the emission of these gases, then engage in emission trading. And if they maintain or increase emissions of these gases, trading has to be done. So, what was this trading? It was referred to as the market mechanism. So, these market mechanisms were of three types. We will take a look into it. But the countries were divided broadly into three groupings now, right? We will take a look at those three groupings as well. Under the principle of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility and differential capacity, because not all the countries have the same capacity. US can easily provide $100 billion in donation with or $10 billion in donation without blinking an eye. But can a country like Sri Lanka provide that amount of money for climate change? Obviously not. Can a country like India provide $10 billion without blinking an eye? Obviously not. There will be repercussions. So all the countries have their own ability, own capacity to fight against climate change. This was realized, this was entered, and it is with the help of these that underdeveloped nations of the world, the G77 grouping, the global south, they were made a partner in this fight against climate change. And what was the target that we have been talking about? The target was that emissions would be reduced by an average of 5% below the 1990 levels. When would the emissions be reduced? In the plan period of 2008 to 2012. So, whatever was your emission in 1990, by the year of 2008 or 2012, you have to reduce the emissions by 5% of your 1990 level. This was the target which was, and the countries were basically divided into groupings. What were those groupings? So you basically had the first grouping, that was of the very developed nations, that was the Annex 1 parties. So countries amongst the developed nations, referred to as the Annex 1 countries, who have accepted greenhouse gas emission reduction obligations, must submit an annual greenhouse gas in. What does this mean? That if you have ratified this convention, whatever annually you are emitting as greenhouse gases, that is something that you basically have to submit an account for, so that it can be verified that you are actually doing something to reduce the amount of emission. Then you had some of the parties, that is the Annex 2, consisting of OECD members of Annex 1 and not the EIT, not the economies in transition. Now, these countries were required to provide financial and technological help to the developing and underdeveloped nations of the world in order to help them fight against climate change. So, think about it, for countries like India, there was no target. But Annex 2 parties were supposed to help countries like India that do one thing. We are not giving you a stringent target. What we are asking you is that you basically provide countries like India with some amount of money, some amount of technology, help them develop alternate and low emission factories and low emission vehicles, and so on. So that was Annex 2 countries. And the countries which were referred to as non Annex 1 nations were underdeveloped, developing nations. Now, they were not given a target, but they were encouraged that you also, from your end, you try to do whatever you can in order to contribute to climate fight against climate change. So these were the three groupings which were arrived at in the Kyoto Protocol. Now, Kyoto Protocol actually introduced a series of market mechanisms. So, first of all, you had a target. What was the target? Target was, a quick recap, target was 5% reduction from 1990 levels. Okay? From 1990 levels. Correct? Now, in case you are not able to meet the target, then what do you do? So, imagine if, let's suppose, as a country, you consider Germany. Now, if Germany, just as an example, if Germany is emitting this much amount of greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide equivalent every year, now the target is that they have to reduce the emissions to this extent. Now they are not able to do so, right? Maybe they have managed to reduce it to some extent, but beyond that, they are not able to. So, what will you do for these extra emissions? For these extra emissions, you need to go for trading of these. Now, how do you trade emissions? If carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, how do you trade it? So basically, as you would have seen, that all the countries were required to maintain a greenhouse gas inventory, that this much amount of tons of carbon dioxide we have emitted. So let's suppose they have emitted 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent extra. That is the extra emission that they have done, right? This is the extra emission that they have done. So they can actually do certain things. There were three mechanisms which were made available to them. One was known as JI, or joint implementation. And this is where Kyoto Protocol was unique. It was different from the earlier Montreal Protocol. It was different from the other conventions earlier. because it had flexibility mechanism which would help the countries meet the target. Then you had clean development mechanism, clean development mechanism, right? Or CDM. And the third would basically be emission trading. Directly you trade the emission. Let's understand what each of them they actually mean. What is the key outcome of each? So Germany decides that this is the extra 10 gigaton of carbon dioxide that I have emitted. I have to fulfill the target. So what Germany can do? It can actually invest in another advanced economy like UK, right? It can actually invest in an advanced economy like UK and help UK set up a clean energy plant, for which UK ideally would have set up a coal power plant, but that coal power plant would have increased the emissions. So, in order to reduce the emissions from other developed nations, would invest there. Now, the immediate question which should come into your mind is that if Germany is investing in UK, why can't Germany reduce its own emissions using that money? Isn't it? If that extra emission for that Germany is investing in UK, why can't Germany invest it itself and save money and reduce the emission? The answer is very simple. That when you are emitting to a certain level, for example, right now, take a look at the emissions that India is doing. Now we know that our emissions are creating pollution problems. But when we see that Delhi is polluted, can we suddenly stop all our emissions? No, because that would involve shutting down of all the factories in the region. That would involve shutting down of all the power plants in the region. That would involve stopping all the construction activities in the region. That would involve stopping all the vehicles moving in that region. Now, that means shutting down the economy, putting the off switch to the entire economic growth. Any country cannot afford to do so. So even India right now, when it is taking a look at the Delhi problem, at best what it can do is it can prepare a 10-year roadmap that in 10 years or in 5 years we will do this so that the emissions level reduce, so that the air will be cleaner. It cannot do something immediately. It is not like a flash in the pan, isn't it? So that is why Germany immediately cannot reduce the emission. But what it can do, it can help other countries reduce their emissions in the long run. So that is like a compensation that they are doing. So it can invest in another advanced economy. Advanced economy. Now, in that advanced economy, it will invest so much that it reduces their emission by 10 gigatons, for example. It will set up so many solar power plants. It will help UK set up so many wind energy farms so that 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide emission which UK would have done, that would not be caused anymore in the future. So that investment of 10 to reduce 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Now, when Germany would invest this much money, Germany would be given credits in return. Now, these credits Germany could show to the world, and then it would say that, look, I had exceeded my emissions by 10 gigatons. This much credit I have got in return, so I have fulfilled my target. This is known as joint implementation. When two advanced economies interact with each other, maybe Annex 1 parties themselves, when they interact with each other to reduce the emissions, that is what is joint implementation. This is one way. The other mechanism would be that, look, Germany says that no, UK is already very developed. I don't want to invest in UK. Okay, I don't want to invest in UK. So, what do I do? So, basically, here, Germany can invest in another country like India in a cleaner energy. And in India, again, to reduce the 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide emission, it can invest, it can provide technological help as well, invest in clean energy, solar plants, wind, wind power, right? And in return, India will give Germany credits, equal amount of credits. This would be referred to as a clean development mechanism. So, clean development mechanism is when you basically have a developed nation investing in an underdeveloped or a developing nation. China and India have been the biggest recipients of such investments since the past almost 1.5 decades. From 2011 onwards, India has been one of the larger recipients after China for these kind of investments from the developed nations. That is where you would have observed many developed nations are partnering and had been partnering with India to expand India's solar power capacity, wind power generation, and so on. So that is CDM or Clean Development Mechanism. Okay. Now, then you basically have the other mechanism, that is emission trading. You set up a carbon market that Germany is basically emitting 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent extra. Now, what do you do of that extra? So you basically go to, let's suppose, Japan, and you say that, okay, Japan, you have emitted less, so you have some extra legroom with you. You give us credits, I will give you money, right? It can trade that extra emission with countries, with companies, it can trade that. That would be referred to as emission trading. So this could be done with countries, companies, etc. So all these three mechanisms were catered in order to provide flexibility, in order to provide the mechanism by which they could fulfill their target. That is where Kyoto Protocol was quite innovative and quite a landmark in terms of that period of time. Okay. Now, after this, so basically, in the case of Kyoto Protocol, you had the three mechanisms: joint implementation, CDM, and emission trading. Okay. Now, here, the outcome or the aspect was also that look, we need to establish a kind of a global fund, what would be referred to as the adaptation fund. We need to provide or set up a global fund so that all the poorer countries, they are able to adapt to climate change. What do we mean by adapt to climate change? For example, we know that the planet is warm. For example, in India, we know that you have very distributed or disturbed amount of rainfall that we receive. In certain months, you have drought conditions. Certain months, you have flood conditions. So why is it that after flood, you have droughts? Because rainwater harvesting is not done. So we need to adapt to these warming conditions. What do we need to do? We need to build rainwater harvesting structures, isn't it? That would require money. Where would you get that money from? So, for that, a global fund should be established. That would be the adaptation fund. Now, this was eventually established in the next few conference of parties that we will take a look in. So, first of all, a quick recap of each one of them. Joint implementation. Joint implementation is where an advanced country A, which has not been able to fulfill its target, will provide technology or finance to another advanced country B, right? To set up an emission reduction project, a clean energy project. And in return for that, the advanced country B will provide credit. Such credit would be referred to as the ERU, emission reduction unit. This credit would be provided to advanced country A, then they would be able to meet the issue. What is the difference between adaptation and mitigation? Mitigation is prevention. I am going to prevent the temperature from rising. That is mitigation. Adaptation is that temperature has risen up. How am I going to adapt to this rising temperature? Okay, so that is the difference. In mitigation, you prevent the emissions. In adaptation, you create water storage structure, you create larger shade areas to prevent against heat waves, you create artificial channels to prevent against floods, and so on. So that is the basic difference between adaptation and mitigation. Okay, now This is the case of joint implementation. I hope nobody will get it wrong now. And then you had the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. Now, Clean Development Mechanism is where an advanced country A would invest in a developing country B. This could include countries like India, countries like China, okay? And it would be again invested in a clean energy project, an emission reduction project, right? And in return, they would be given credits, like I explained before, and these credits would be referred to as CER, that is Certified Emission Reduction. That would be the name of the credit. In joint implementation, what was the name? Emission Reduction Unit, ERU. In the case of Clean Development Mechanism, it is the CER, Certified Emission Reduction. This is just a modality of the different names of these credits. Overall, the basic principle is one and the same. Okay. And then, if none of these you want to do, you don't want to invest in a developed nation, you don't want to invest in a developing nation, then what you can do? Then you can basically carry out emission trading. So in emission trading, you basically you can carry out that trading with another country, like Germany can trade with Japan. That, look, you have not emitted so much, you have some scope, give us that extra scope in form of credit, we will pay you money. Or any, let's suppose any industry, like let's suppose any oil producing industry has been given a target that this is how much you emit. Now they have managed to overachieve it, they have emitted much less, so they have some scope, so I can trade with that also, right? So that is where you can basically trade the emissions, and here you would be given the credit AAU, assigned amount unit. Okay, one credit, one credit, or one carbon credit would amount to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emission. What do we mean by carbon dioxide equivalent? For example, let's suppose you are considering methane emission. Now, methane, what will be the equivalent of carbon dioxide? 1 kg of methane, how much amount of carbon dioxide? So that is why, in order to have a fixed unit of measurement, CO2 or CO2 equivalent was to be considered. So that was the case of the three market mechanisms provided by Kyoto Protocol. I hope this is as clear as it can be. After Kyoto Protocol, once this was done, then the discussion was how to implement this. Because mind you, we were still in 1997. The plan period was 2008 to 2012. There was a lot of opposition. Various countries, for example, Canada was opposed to this, US was opposed to this. US's contention was that you have bigger emitters like China, and you are not asking China to fulfill the target. You are not asking China to do this JI, CDM, and ET. You are asking us, we won't do it, right? So you have emitters like India, they are not doing it. They don't have target. Why should we do it? In fact, Canada also exited this legality of Kyoto Protocol in the late 2000s, because Canada's contention was that US has exited. US also exited this. US has exited it. China is not a part of it. If major emitters are not a part of it, why should we care? So Canada also exited. So that there was a lot of confusion as well. But majority of the countries of the world, they were spending their energy in order to devise the modalities of it. That, okay, how do we set up a carbon market? European carbon market, for that matter, was set up in early 2000s. Around 2005 was when the carbon markets were set up, and the trading started immediately after that. So there was this legality of how to set up these targets, or how to basically ensure that the credit is transparent. Right. So that is where, in Conference of Parties number 4, that was held in Buenos Aires in Argentina, what was adopted was BAPA, Buenos Aires Plan of Action. Just like Berlin Mandate, this Buenos Aires Plan of Action is also important for your prelims examination. Remember the Berlin Mandate associated with the first conference of party? PAPA is also important for your examination because here the plan of action post Kyoto, arrival of the Kyoto Protocol, what should we do? So that was something which was discussed. So it agreed for a 2 year work program to elaborate the rules because it could not be done in 1 minute. It is not as if today everybody would sit down and they would say that, okay, JI would be like this, CDM would be like this, adaptation fund would be like this. No, all the countries have to agree to it. The countries, when they discuss it, they will have to take it back to their own governments. They will have to discuss it with their finance ministry. They will have to discuss it in their parliament, get the approval. So it would take time. So that is why a 2 year work program to elaborate the rules for sink, carbon sink, flexibility mechanism, and accounting. How do you account for the emissions, the trade, etc. Advanced methodological guidance for the greenhouse gas inventories. For example, I am a country and I say that I have not emitted any methane. So there should be a measure of check with the help of the satellites and so on. So, how do you maintain that greenhouse gas inventory? Do all the countries have required mechanism and the standard operating procedure to maintain that inventory? So, all this was a part of Buenos Aires Plan of Action or PAPA. Preparation of rules for the flexibility mechanism. Then the Conference of Parties returned to Germany again after 4 years. And Conference of Parties number 5 was held in Bonn in Germany. So additional decisions to flesh out mechanisms, accounting rules, reporting formats, and to prepare for much tougher COP6. COP6 was very, very difficult. The talks broke down. So much so that in Conference of Parties number 6, which was held in Hague, it was many of the countries threatened to walk out of the convention itself. That is why COP6 took place in two installments. The first part in November 2000 was held in Hague, whereas where all the bickering happened, all the fighting happened. Developed nations were fighting that we will not give money. Developing nations should be made accountable. Developing nations were saying that our demand should be met. How is it that you are basically ignoring the demands of the population of the developing nation? Just because we are poor doesn't mean that we are not concerned with climate, right? So that is where you had countries like India, China, South Africa. They started forming a kind of a grouping and a coalition. Okay. Now, in Hague, the talks collapsed. And there was very deep disagreement between EU, the European Union, the US, the G77, the Global South. There was heavy disagreement about the flexibility mechanism and what should be considered to be the compliance. That do we necessarily have to carry out this trading? Can we do otherwise or not? US was very hell bent on saying that this is not done. That is why US exited the next year itself. Now, the meeting was charged and was associated with high stakes, and it ended prematurely. Then again, all the nations they came together, and this COP6 that again reconvened basically in Bonn in 2001. Immediately next year, all the members they convened. And here the Bonn agreements were arrived at. So when you have to think about Bonn agreement, think about it. It is an agreement. When do countries arrive at an agreement? When there is some amount of difference and they have to come together. So Bonn agreement was generated, was created out of the discord created at the Conference of Parties number 6 at Hague. Okay. Now, interim package of political decisions and cleared the way for the implementation mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. That how do you implement that? And Marrakesh, where the next conference of parties was supposed to be held, for that the roadmap was prepared. The Bonn outcome was important politically because it actually revived the entire process of climate convention. Because as I told you, at The Hague, all the countries threatened to walk out of the climate convention, and the entire global fight against climate change, that was to be put in a lot of danger. Right. Now, here, Conference of Parties number 7, that is Marrakesh in Morocco, that was held amidst lot of global headlines. And this was in 2001 itself, the later part of 2001. And here, the Marrakesh Accords were arrived at. Now, here, the decisions operationalized the outcomes of the Kyoto Protocol. So, in Kyoto Protocol, these were the outlines. The outlines were decided. But then, how to operationalize them? When to operationalize them? For that, also, you needed a roadmap. So, the modalities and the procedures for mechanism, for compliance, accounting, reporting for the Kyoto Protocol, that was finalized. So Marrakesh COP was also very important, right? And these decisions made the protocol implementable once it would be ratified. All that was required was ratification. Okay. And don't get confused in all these names. Don't worry. What I will do is I will provide to you with a detailed summary of all the conference of parties, the major outcomes of it up till 1995 to 2015. The moment we reach up till Paris Agreement, I will give you a detailed summary. And then post Paris Agreement to the COP, which was held recently in Belém, I will give you another summary. And then along with that, I will give you a summary to give you an idea about all the important conference of parties as well. So that would help you revise it and help you retain it as well. So right now, what I want you to do is I want you to understand the geopolitical equations and the various different angles and the various different perspectives which were at stake when this conference of parties were being held. Okay, right. BAPA and Conference of Parties number 7. So, BAPA was basically where it was decided that now we will work on the roadmap for this. Conference of Parties number 7 was the end period of BAPA, right? So, that 2 year roadmap, which was started at BAPA, ended at Marrakesh. Okay. And that is where the implementation and all these were finalized. So think about it. You basically start that in Bapa or in Buenos Aires, you decide that, okay, from now on, we will start working on the modalities, how to ensure the measurement, compliance, and so on. And you work for that for 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, all the countries agree to that. So that is the journey from Buenos Aires to Marrakesh. Okay. Now, the accords covered CDM modalities, which were in lot of discussion. Developed countries did not want to invest in poorer nations. That I can invest in US. Don't ask me to invest in China. Don't ask me to invest in India. What if India doesn't take care of the solar plants and India doesn't give me credits? Then what? So those CDM modalities that were covered in the accord, the reporting guidelines and guidance for the sinks, the carbon sinks. That was something which was done in the Marrakesh. Here, the IPCC's, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change that I have mentioned. Now, IPCC had generated good practice guidance regarding greenhouse gas inventories. Remember, we talked about the fact that there was an importance which was felt that all the various countries need to have a standardized greenhouse gas incentive or the greenhouse gas inventory. So that was then released by IPCC because IPCC is a scientific arm. IPCC gives you scientific recommendation, right? So that is where adoption and endorsement of the IPCC good practices guidance was done. Now, the Marrakesh Accords are referred to as the rule book for Kyoto Protocol's mechanism. Okay, this is referred to as the rule book for the Kyoto Protocol mechanism. Yes. It is important for you for your prelims examination to retain this IPCC. IPCC was formed by UNEP plus World Meteorological Organization. Okay. Till now, IPCC has generated how many reports? It has generated six assessment reports. Okay, six assessment reports. The seventh assessment report is about to come within a year or two. So that is where these IPCC reports, they carry a great weightage as well. Then after that, Conference of Parties number 8 was held in New Delhi, India. Now, one issue that we have with the Conference of Parties which was held in India, where you can differentiate it from the other Conference of Parties held in different parts of the globe, India somehow failed to market itself as a major player against climate change. It did not market itself because when you are a host of Conference of Parties, it is a very prestigious thing. Look at how Brazil, for the past year, has been marketing itself as a champion of climate change because the Conference of Parties was being held in Brazil. Turkey has been doing it for the next year, right? So there has been a kind of that lack of global appeal on Indian side in terms of marketing itself. As a consequence of that, what happens? Now you might have a question: why do we need to market ourselves? We need to do action. Why to market? The reason is that many countries, after this Conference of Parties, they continue to blame India as the major emitter source, and they continue to blame and label India as one of the most irresponsible nations when it comes to fight against climate change. Now this is clearly a propaganda of the Western nations to put pressure on India, but still we needed to have a counter that look, we are a historical civilization, thousands of years old, and climate, nature conservation has been a part of our traditional outlook. So that outreach was somehow slightly missing during this Conference of Parties. And one can argue that look, in 2001 and 2002, we had our own series of crises. We had the global sanctions imposed upon us due to the nuclear test. We had just come out of a very financially draining war. There were various different kinds of parliamentary deadlocks that the coalition government was operating under. So there was a lot of pressure that we were in. But still, this was an opportunity which was slightly missed. Having said that, when the Conference of Parties was held in India, India basically used this opportunity to champion the cause of the poor. And India said that, look, you are blaming the poorer nations, you are blaming the developing nations, but unless and until the poverty will be eradicated, unless and until you ensure that the poorer population they get their justifiable rights, till that point of time there is no point of fighting against climate change. You cannot ask India to reduce emissions. If we don't have the technology for solar cells, we will build thermal power plants, we will build fired power plants, we will run industries on coal, on diesel, or provide us with the technology, provide us with the financial assistance, or wait for us to develop that technology. But we cannot put our citizens at risk just because the global ego and prestige has to be settled. So that was where India became one of the champions of the global south, right? So post Marrakesh, moving from rule making to implementation, that how implementation has to be done. Marrakesh Accords, rule book for the entire mechanism against climate change, rule book for the Kyoto Protocol was the Marrakesh Accords. So developing countries emphasized adaptation and technology transfer, and they emphasized that focus on adaptation, capacity building, technology transfer, and the needs of developing. Okay, it was not a very eventful conference of parties, so to say. A Delhi declaration was arrived at, but this Delhi declaration largely talked about the case of the serving or providing sustainable development, eradicating poverty, social justice, all those things, which generally would be included in our 5 year plans also, inclusive growth and so on. Then Conference of Parties number 9 moved to Milan, Italy, again back to Europe. Now, when these Conference of Parties are held in Europe or in the region of the developed nations generally have the sway. right? So, continued operationalization and refinement of CDM, the work was carried out because now the plan period was nearing 2008. Now it was becoming clear to all the countries what their responsibilities are going to be. Additional guidance on mechanism, capacity building for developing nations, and work on inventories and mitigation strategies. Then again, Conference of Parties moved to Buenos Aires, COP10, which was held in Argentina, Buenos Aires. Now, Kyoto Protocol had now been opened for signature, but still ratification was not done. By this point of time, US had initially withdrawn. So that created a panic amongst all the nations that if the most powerful nation, the surviving superpower of the world, the most advanced economy of the world, if US has exited this, why should we be a part of it? So initially the countries were hesitant. Now, that is why the ratification of Kyoto Protocol, because mind you, unless and until Kyoto Protocol is ratified, till that point of time, why will any country or when will it come into force? If it does not come into force, will it be legally binding? No. So, further technical development, decisions on adaptation framework, CDM experience, preparation for the future. What should happen after the first plan period? That discussions started because it was understood that it is not the case that between 2008 to 2012 the entire fight against climate change will be won. And people had witnessed the opposition to Kyoto Protocol. So, what should be done after 2012, which will be acceptable to the entirety of the world, where the developed nations don't feel alienated? And what should be that comprehensive action that the countries have to think about and work upon? Now, then, the Conference of Parties, number 11. By this point of time, Kyoto Protocol had been ratified and was to action. The Kyoto Protocol entered into force on 16th of Feb 2005 after enough number of ratifications. So once the Kyoto Protocol entered into force, that is why this is also referred to as MOP1. What is MOP? The meeting of parties, the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So overall, it was Conference of Parties number 11. But for the first time, the parties to the Kyoto Protocol were meeting. So that is why it is also regarded as MOP1. This was held in Montreal in Canada. Okay. Now, COP11 was the first meeting where the Kyoto mechanisms began to be implemented. Now, by this point of time, mind you, I had told you that carbon markets were established around 2005. Carbon markets were established. Now, carbon markets were established means what? That trading and carbon credits, and their trading that could be done. Right. So implementation had started to happen, not in full-fledged manner, but implementation had begun. Focus on operationalizing the protocol, the compliance committee work, CDM project pipeline issues. That, for example, what do we mean by CDM project pipeline issue? That let's suppose Germany also wants to earn credit, UK also wants to earn credit, Japan also wants to earn credit. All of them want to invest. Now, where would you want to invest? Wherever you get the best return, isn't it? Wherever you get the best return. So all of them want to invest either in China or in India. So you need to have you need to have sufficient credit system created. You need to have land allocation and everything sorted from that destination country as well. So many of these projects were piling up. It is here also that India lost out to China because we did not provide enough clearance to the projects at an equal rate. China would provide very quick clearance of projects. Vietnam started gaining. But India, obviously, there was environmental issue. Because of environmental issues, we did not provide many of the clearances to the projects. So the projects were diverted to Vietnam, even Cambodia, even China. So in this period, China was amongst the largest recipients of the foreign investment. Strengthened attraction, attention to adaptation or technology transfer, and finance for the developing nations. Then you had COP 12. Now we are coming close to the plan period of Kyoto Protocol. So discussions started getting tense about whether this Kyoto Protocol, whatever we are suggesting, will that be sufficient, or what is the use of it? Right? After all, countries like China, countries like India, they are still going to emit. And this is where the developed nations, they had formed a kind of a grouping, and they had basically started buying off some of the smaller nations that don't agree to everything that these countries are saying. We will pay you money, but we won't pay everyone money. Okay. So because Conference of Parties and United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change, it works on consensus basis. It does not work on majority basis. That is, unless and until all the members agree to a certain point, all the members agree to a certain agenda, a decision is not taken. So that is why the consensus was slowly and steadily drawn against India and China. And this is where countries like India and China, they started reacting. And the entire outburst happened next year. That is in Bali. So, launch of the Nairobi Work Program. Nairobi Work Program also important, just like the Berlin Mandate and BAPA. Nairobi Work Program is also important for your prelims. So, Nairobi Work Program on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation to climate change. So, the discussion began and came back to what are the damages or what are the dangers which are faced, which are risked due to climate change. A dedicated program to help countries improve their understanding of impacts and make informed adaptation decisions. Build the knowledge base for adaptation policy, finance and technology transfer as well. Okay, so that is also something which was worked upon. Then after that, you basically had the showdown in Bali, that is Conference of Parties 13, which was held in Bali. Here, there was a challenge to the basic principle of CBDR. The challenge was, and the challenge which was posed was that there was a greater realization amongst many of the countries that even if you take the plan period of 2008 to 12, it won't be very successful against climate change because you have large emitters like China and India, which are outside this. And this is when China and India got together and they reacted very sharply. And that is where they ensured that eventually in the Bali roadmap, the principle of CBDR was adhered to. No country had the option of escaping the principle of CBDR. They basically garnered the support of the developing nations and the underdeveloped nations. So, this is where the coming together of India and China happened in Bali. So, multilateral realization that Kyoto alone would not deliver full global coverage. Major emitters needed to be included in any future regime. Post Kyoto, what needs to be done? Okay. So COP 13 got a roadmap to a post 2012 framework. That post 2012 make India also accountable, make China also accountable. Because mind you, by this point of time, China had started emerging. China had started to indicate signs of being on a upper income level, right? The surge of technical work on NAMAs. That is what each government can do in order to mitigate climate change. That is nationally appropriate mitigation action beyond the realm and beyond the rules of Kyoto Protocol. As a country, what you can do to fight against climate change. So you should not only rely on Kyoto Protocol, you should bring your own mechanisms at work as well. So that is where the Bali roadmap basically includes NAMA. Now, here, framework, technology roadmap, adaptation strategy that was worked upon. Now, Bali set 5 building blocks, a shared vision that all of you, we have a common goal. What is the common goal? Fight against climate change. So, shared vision. Mitigation, that we have to prevent climate change. Adaptation, if climate or the global warming is already happening, how do we adapt to that? Finance, we need funding, and it is undeniable that we need funding. Then, technology transfer, and that would create the negotiating platform for eventually COP15. Bali Action Plan or the Bali Roadmap unlocked a 2 year negotiating process. Just like BAPA had a 2 year negotiating process, here also a 2 year negotiating process was initiated. And this was basically under two different tracks. Ad hoc working group on long term cooperative action, that is where underdeveloped developing nations would also be urged that what will you do after 2012. So that was AWG-LCA, and then you had AWG-KP. So this was in order to ask the developed nations that give more money, give more funding, give more developmental assistance, give more technological transfer. Only then will we be able to fight against climate change. So this was for the developed nation, developed nation. Okay. And the developed nations were asked for more commitments in terms of funding, commitments, and more technology assistance. Assist. Okay. Whereas this was for the post 2012 commitments, actions. Eventually, principle of CBDR was strengthened. Principle of CBDR was reinforced. Okay, it was reinforced. Okay, then after that, you had COP14, which was slightly uneventful in Poland, in Poznan. Now, this was the midpoint of the Bali roadmap because Bali roadmap was a 2 year roadmap. So, next year, it was the midpoint. So, parties moved from broad mandates toward concrete negotiating points, which could be then finalized in COP15 at Copenhagen. And from here, the plan period of Kyoto Protocol had begun. Plan period for Kyoto Protocol had begun. Kyoto Protocol had begun. Still, as you would see, that the countries have not arrived at a concrete action plan for the future, what to do after 2012. Now, operationalization of the adaptation fund was done. This is relevant for your prelims. So, adaptation fund would be created out of CDM. Okay. When what was it operationalized? At COP 14, Poland. Okay. Now, this was where adaptation fund was made fully operational and funding was sourced from where? 2% levy on the CDM projects which were under the Kyoto Protocol. So 2% levy would be charged from them. So if let's suppose Germany is investing $1 billion, so out of that 2% levy would be created and it would be given to the adaptation fund. Okay, enable direct access for developing countries to adaptation finance. Then you had COP15, Copenhagen, and it was a summit. Summit meeting means what is a summit meeting? G20 summit, Rio Summit. Summit is basically where the heads of the state they tend to participate, right? The heads of the state, the top level of the government. So this was a kind of a summit meeting. So parties here attempted to finalize the post 2012 deal, what should be done after 2012. But they differed sharply in terms of whether it should be legally binding, what should be the mechanism. And here Kelrose, finance, what is Kelrose? Quantified emission limitation and reduction objective. So Kelrose, finance, and the differentiation, this was where you had a lot of difference. Copenhagen Accord was arrived at. It was not adopted as a formal outcome of the Conference of Party. It was just noted because everybody did not agree to it. That is why not formally recognized. But it represented a political agreement submitted by a small group of countries: US, China, Brazil, India, South Africa, the major players across the world. They had agreed. And this is where the global geopolitics had started changing. You basically had Barack Obama being at the helm of affairs in Europe. And Barack Obama was a champion and has been a champion against climate change. So Barack Obama was more than willing to partner with countries like India and China for a larger objective against climate change. Now, the Accord recognized the scientific view that warming should be limited below 2 degrees Celsius. Because, mind you, all these goals that warming should be limited below 2 degrees Celsius, all of this funding should be provided, mobilizing $100 billion, all of that came later. Kyoto Protocol did not include these. Okay. So here, invited countries to submit their mitigation pledge. That what would you do to fight against climate change? Introduced immediate financial commitments from the various countries, a roadmap towards mobilizing $100 billion annually by 2020 by the developed nations themselves, that they have to provide $100 billion annually. Okay, so this work was done in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen Accord was actually arrived at. Then COP16, that happened in Mexico, Cancun in Mexico. Now, here, Cancun agreements were arrived at. Now, modalities for MRV. MRV basically started, the work of MRV started in Bali itself, right? This started in Bali in 2007. So, that is where it had started already. Okay. So, a set of decisions collectively known as the recognized as the Copenhagen Pledges, established the Cancun Adaptation Framework associated with United Nations Framework on Climate Change. Now, MRV is what? Measurement, reporting, and verification. This was to build transparency in the climate action and the mitigation plan by each of the countries. Decision to establish the Green Climate Fund. It was a major decision. What is the funding agency for UNFCCC? The funding agency for UNFCCC is GEF, Global Environment Fund. Now, that is also the funding agency for the Convention on Biological Diversity and United Nations Convention to combat desertification. But that was turning out to be inadequate. That is where Green Climate Fund was established. So this Green Climate Fund is the world's largest dedicated fund established under United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to help the developing countries finance the climate action. Now, this has been asked in the prelims examination. Okay. When was it established? It was established in Cancun in 2010 in Mexico. So this is GCF. So shifting to low emission, climate resilient development by supporting mitigation, that is cutting emissions, and adaptation strategy. Headquartered at in South Korea. Now aims for 50-50 split between funding for mitigation and funding for adaptation project. Vulnerable, the focus would be on the least developed countries and the small island developing nations and also the African countries. That would be the key focus of GCF because obviously the case of GEF was turning out to be inadequate. Okay. Now, another mechanism which was arrived at, which was started again in Bali. So, MRV was also started in Bali. This was also started in Bali. That was RED. Now, what is RED and RED plus? RED plus basically refers to reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation, plus conservation and sustainable management. So earlier, RED concept was launched in 2007 in Bali. Okay. This was also, and this is also something which had been asked in the prelims examination. So RED concept was basically launched in Bali. At that point of time, it was simply reducing emissions from deforestation, because one thing that many of you might not know is that deforestation is amongst the major sources of carbon emission. When you have dense trees, the trees absorb carbon dioxide. They are the sinks for carbon dioxide. But when you cut down the trees, there is a lot of methane, etc., which gets released. So they become the sources of carbon emission. So that is where RED plus mechanism was actually provided. India was amongst the major supporters of that in order to prevent the emissions caused by deforestation in many countries. Countries like Indonesia, countries like Brazil, deforestation was being carried out and is still being carried out in large numbers. So to basically prevent them. Then 2010 in Cancun, RED expanded to RED plus, which included conservation, sustainable management, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. Okay, this also aimed eventually that if you conserve the forest in an area, if you basically prevent deforestation, you will empower the indigenous population also, the local community also. And that is where eventually in the long run, it would fight off poverty, fight against poverty. Okay. In the long run, there would be fight against poverty as well. Now, 2013 is where the Warsaw Framework for RED Plus was established, and their detailed rules, safeguard, etc. mechanism was given. So, this is the evolution cycle of RED and RED Plus. Okay. Now, what is this RED Plus? So, it provides a kind of a holistic framework for for the fight against climate change in the forest sector, and five RED plus activities are reducing emission from deforestation, reducing emission from forest degradation, conservation of forest carbon stocks, sustainable management of forest, and enhancement of carbon stocks. Means afforestation program should be carried out. So, what the countries were required to do, develop national strategies for prevention of deforestation, policies and measures, and capacity building. Implementation would involve further capacity building, technology development and transfer, and result based demonstration activities, right? And countries implementing RED Plus must provide information. They have to be transparent on how social and environmental safeguards are being addressed and they are being considered. Now, there would be measurement also, verification also. So, National Forest Monitoring System, data and information regarding what is the status of the forest in each of the country. Now, National RED Plus strategy or action plan by each of the nations addressed the assessed forest. What is the reference that you are considering? So, for example, if I say I have this much amount of forest carbon stock, but there has to be a reference period, isn't it? There has to be a reference period. Since when are you comparing? Are you comparing it since 1900 recently, or when? Right? And there have to be safeguards. Okay, so that is basically the property or the feature of Red Plus. Then you had COP 17, which was held in Durban. Now, by this time, there was a realization that the plan period of 2012 is The end plan period of 2012 is nearing, and we still don't have a roadmap beyond 2012. What to do beyond 2012? Whether we have a new protocol, whether a new agreement will be arrived at or not, that was not there in the cards. So when you had the Conference of Parties number 17, which was held in Durban, South Africa, now with the Kyoto Protocol covering only developed countries, a new broader approach was needed. Post 2012, that was still indecisive. So Durban platform parties, they basically launch a process to develop new legal instrument, right? Applicable to be all the parties to be completed by 2050 and operational from 20. This is the precursor to the precursor to Paris Agreement. The hope was that in the next 4 years, we will arrive at an agreement, whatever that agreement might be, we will arrive at the agreement, and then that agreement would be implemented from 2020. But from 2012 to 2020, 2012 to 2020, what needed to be done, that was still not decided, right? So this decision effectively set the political timetable which led to the Paris Agreement. Okay. Now, Durban also agreed on the second commitment period of Kyoto. So what was decided was that, look, the first plan period was 2008 to 2012. Next, whatever we are deciding will come into place after the Paris agree or after 2020. So from 2012 to 2020, let's extend the provisions of Kyoto Protocol itself. Okay. Red Plus began in Bali. It was agreed upon through Cancun. The implementation and finalization was done in Warsaw, and thereafter the implementation began. It started in Bali as Red. The Red Plus happened in Cancun. The entire framework was established in Warsaw. Okay. Now, the second commitment period of Kyoto, that is what to happen between 2012 and 2020, that was agreed at the Durban, and it would be modified next year in the Doha Amendment. So operationalization of Green Climate Fund was achieved in this particular stage. So formal steps were taken to operationalize the GCF agreement in terms of the governance structure, right? World Bank would be the initial trustee of the GCF as well. Just like World Bank is the trustee of Global Environment Facility, similarly for the Green Climate Fund, the World Bank would be trustee. Transitional arrangements role as the primary multilateral climate finance channel, reinforce the long-term goal of $100 billion per year for the developing nations after 2020. Then you had this Conference of Parties number 18 in Doha, in Qatar. This is where Doha Amendment was arrived at. Doha Amendment is again a landmark that you have to be aware of. And this Doha Amendment extended the second phase of Kyoto, up till 2020. Okay. So finalize the elements for the 2015 agreement while keeping the Kyoto process alive. The Doha Amendment provided the second commitment period of Kyoto from 2013 up till 2020. Okay. And it was limited in ambition, but implementation was something which was focused on. New goals were not decided, but implementation was focused. Then, Conference of Parties number 19, Warsaw in Poland. This is where Red Plus mechanism was also devised, the framework of it. And this is also known as the LND Conference of Party, because loss and damage was something which was just in greater detail. What is this concept of loss and damage? The concept is that, look, you have various different countries like Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan. Now they are suffering, small island nations like Tuvalu. Now we are suffering the brunt of climate change. And that climate change is not caused by us, it is caused historically by the developed nation. So, where do we get the fund for that loss and damage? How do we repair ourselves? How do we mitigate or how do we adapt to that? So, for that, there needs to be a loss and damage fund created. So, that discussion started in Warsaw, right? So, agreement to establish a work stream on loss and damage. And when was this implemented, by the way? This started in Conference of Parties number 19. It was eventually implemented in Conference of Parties number 27. To think about it, how many years passed by for the discussion of loss and damage, which used to happen continuously. Because the developed nations would say, we will not give money. Ask us anything, ask us for broader goals, we will not give money. And mind you, at this point of time, the world was also going through a financial crisis. So getting money from the developed nations was not easy either. So this led to later Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Right? Now, then you had COP20, that is Lima in Peru. Now, this is where you had a broader modality agreed upon for Paris Agreement. That Paris Agreement had to be different from Kyoto Protocol. How? So, in Kyoto Protocol, you basically had devised a mechanism whereby you had fixed targets to the nation. You had given the nations with certain targets, and the nations had to fulfill that. And that was the key sticking point for many countries. By 2011, Canada had also exited because Canada had said that US is not a part of this Kyoto Protocol. China is not a part of this Kyoto Protocol. These are the larger emitters. Why should we be a part of the Kyoto Protocol? Why should we have these targets imposed on us? Because when you give someone any target, it is a kind of an imposition, and the countries are not ready for that. So that is where you basically had a kind of an opposition. And the thought process was that rather than giving the countries a target, whatever has to follow the Kyoto Protocol, the countries should bring their own targets. Right. So that is where INDC intended nationally determined contributions. That guidance was something on which work had started. Okay. The final major negotiating step before the Paris Agreement, because by this point of time, Paris Agreement was more or less realized. And it is here that US took the lead. And this is where credit where it is due. You have to give credit to US and in particular Barack Obama as well. So that is where countries like France, countries like US, they were basically canvassing, dealing with, and multiple meetings were being held with the developing nations that, okay, we will not give targets. This is what we are seeking to do. We will participate in that. Okay. So Lima's task was to produce a clear negotiating text and guidance to ensure that parties, all the members, they submit a comparable pre 2015 INDs. Okay. FEMA call for climate action was issued, where a text, negotiating text for the Paris Agreement, and a common reporting or communication format for INDC. For example, the country should be clear upon that whether you will reduce the carbon intensity, by when will you achieve net zero, all these matters were to be discussed. Okay, so this is the basic timeline that you can associate for the major COPs between 1995 to 2015. This is a brief recap for all of you. So, COP1, Berlin, that is where you had the Berlin Mandate. Then another important one was COP3, that is the Kyoto Protocol. So adoption of Kyoto Protocol, right? So this was basically where eventually BAPA was also being discussed. Now this is COP7 2001, Buenos Aires Plan of Action. Okay. So Berlin Mandate and BAPA, they helped develop the clean development mechanism and finalization of the Kyoto regime. Then Marrakesh Accords. Marrakesh Accords eventually were the rule book for the Kyoto Protocol. And these Marrakesh Accords, they finalized the rules for joint implementation, CDM, emission trading, adaptation fund, and the work started for post Kyoto work. Then you basically had eventually the Cancun, where you had the Cancun agreements, Green Climate Fund, Cancun framework, Nairobi work program. All of these were done. Okay. Then you have the COP 21, which was landmark, which was the Paris. Now, Paris Agreement was different as compared to the Kyoto Protocol. Now, Paris Agreement basically had a kind of a guideline that we have to limit the warming by 2 degrees Celsius, if possible, by 1.5 degrees Celsius, but by maximum 2 degrees Celsius. Okay. And rather than giving the countries the target, we will develop a mechanism where each and every country they come up with INDC, that is intended nationally determined contributions. Contribution. INDC. Okay. Now each country will submit what is it that they want to do in the fight against climate change. Now, these countries also have to open themselves for inspection. Every 5 years, there will be a global stock take. 5 years, verification, and open for inspection. The MRV mechanism. Remember the MRV mechanism, which started way back from Bali itself. So, verification and inspection. And this is where you basically would have the case of global stocktake mechanism. Stocktake mechanism. Then, other than that, further reinvigorated and cemented the principle of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility. Differentiated responsibility. Okay. Other than that, they also talked about the case of net zero emissions. Emissions. What were the net zero emissions? That whatever amount of carbon dioxide equivalent you are emitting, you have to ensure that you have enough absorption capacity as well. Right? Either reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emitted or have enough forests so that all the carbon dioxide is sequestered there. So the net zero emissions advisable by the countries, advisable to be achieved by 2050. By 2050. Okay. Now, the warming had to be restricted by 2 degrees Celsius, if possible, 1.5. So, aim was to achieve peak emissions as early as possible. Achieve peak emissions as early as possible. Okay. As possible. And then by newer technologies, newer tech, ensure cooling post 2050. That technology would have developed to such an extent that carbon sequestration, etc., could be effective. So this was the broader mechanism. $100 billion of funding to the developing nations obviously was one of the measures which was talked about. So the Paris Agreement, the key outcomes, provides the post Kyoto Protocol commitments to combat climate change, commits the 196 countries to work together to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above the pre industrial levels, with a stretch goal of keeping it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay? Stopping the rise of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. Long term goal well below 2 degrees Celsius, pursue 1.5, nationally determined contributions by each of the countries, 5-year cycle for these NDCs, global stock take, and enhanced transparency framework that all the countries have to be transparent about their emissions. Okay? Now, it is not a treaty, and the INDCs are not binding, but generally, the expectation is that when you submit the next INDC after 5 years, you have to submit a better goal, a more aggressive goal. Right? For example, as a student, let's suppose you have said that in the next 10 days, I will finish 2 chapters. So, after that, when you submit your next target, it has to be a bit more aggressive that I will complete 3 chapters. So, that was the expectation. The deal contains some binding element. What is the binding element in the deal? The countries have to participate in a system for measuring their progress in achieving the goals. How do you do that? So, the member countries will be evaluated every 5 years. The poorer countries would be given some amount of funding to cope against the brunt of the climate change. Now, here, GCAA was arrived at on the sidelines of the Paris Agreement. So it was basically the global climate action agenda. This was arrived at. So these bodies are now being asked in the prelims examination. All these bodies are being asked about the features of these bodies. Okay. So umbrella framework to showcase voluntary climate actions by non-state actors. So, annual tracking of progress by the countries and bridge between COP negotiations and what is the implementation which is happening on the ground. That is the work of GCAA. Track the progress. What is the progress? And every year, when the COP negotiations are happening, in between that period of time, what is the implementation? Then, once again, in 2016, you had the COP 22, which was held in Marrakesh, Morocco. This time, the COP was held under a lot of confusion. And there was a lot of doubt whether you basically are still aligned to the Paris Agreement or not. Why? Because Barack Obama, who had steered this entire movement of Paris Agreement, Obama left office. And US was now being governed by one and only Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, not mindful of the fact that US was the one which was key in the Paris Agreement, decided to exit the Paris Agreement. So with the exit of US from the entire framework of Paris Agreement, the developed nations were in a doldrum, right? That whether we commit the funding or not. Developing nations were again in confusion that we were supposed to get some financial help. Now we won't get that financial help, right? So work program was initiated for drafting the Paris rule book for the rest of them. So political reaffirmation of the Paris Agreement was something which was worked upon. Now, here, Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action was something which was arrived at. So, it includes what is this? So, it includes cities, regions, companies, civil society organizations, and various investors. It is an institutional platform to coordinate non state climate action. What do we mean by non state climate action? So, all the climate change, uh, fight against climate change that cannot only be led by the government itself, isn't it? As individual companies, also, you need to do something in order to fight against climate change. So that is where you had the non state climate action to support that, to coordinate that. That institutional platform was provided by Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, again relevant for prelims. So it would organize work around various themes like energy, transport, land use, water use, industry, human settlements, and so on. The first formal recognition that government alone, they are not sufficient to meet the climate goals. This was the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. Okay. Then you had COP23, which was held in Bonn. Now, in this, small island developing states, they highlighted the vulnerability issue. And they basically highlighted the funding issues with GEF, funding issues with GEF, Global Environment Facility. That proper and timely funding was not being provided to the various different countries. Now, Ocean Pathway Partnership was arrived at, Talanoa Dialogue was being arrived at. What they are, we'll discuss that also. Enhanced visibility of indigenous people, the knowledge of the local population, the local community, and continued drafting of the Paris rulebook because Paris agreement was to be implemented post 2019 and 2020. Okay, so here, first of all, Talanoa Dialogue, again important for your prelims examination. So Talanoa Dialogue, that was launched. And mind you, at this point of time, Conference of Parties number 23, it was held in Bonn, but basically the presidency was with Fiji. Fiji had presidency. But Fiji could not hold this. So that is why it was held in Bonn in Germany. Okay. So Talanoa Dialogue. So governments plus various different cities, organizations, business, NGOs, all of them, they came together to develop a story-based dialogue format overall, rooted basically in the local traditions of the Pacific Islands. It was held in Fiji. Fiji is an island nation in Pacific. So that is where the interest of these particular nations were at the forefront. That is why you also had the Ocean Pathway Partnership, linking oceans to climate change. Discussions basically about the ocean acidification, ocean as carbon sinks and carbon emitters, that was on the forefront. It is in this that Talanoa dialogue was basically arrived at. And a story based format, that what stage are we in terms of the fight against climate change or in terms of the present situation, right? Where do we want to go and how do we get there? Okay. This brought non-state actors directly into the ambition discussion. Non-governmental, that is NGOs, they became a part, companies, they became a part of these discussions. Okay. Then that is the case of Talanoa Dialogue. So Talanoa Dialogue, where was it arrived at? When was it arrived at? At Conference of Parties number 23, which was held in Bonn in Germany. Okay. Then Ocean Pathway Partnership. This was also arrived at under the presidency of Fiji. Conference of Parties number 23 itself. Coastal cities, island states, NGOs, researchers. Basically, because of climate change, the ocean water is also rising, right? So, for example, Tuvalu. Tuvalu is one of those small islands which will get completely submerged under ocean. So that is where the planned migration of all the citizens of Tuvalu is happening, right? So that is where Ocean Pathway Partnership was arrived at, and Ocean Climate Nexus, sea level rise, coral bleaching, coastal resilience, mangrove ecosystems, these were being discussed. Oceans formally integrated into climate discourse through state action. Then you had Conference of Parties number 24, again returning to Europe, and it was held in Katowice in Poland. So here, Katowice Climate Package of Transparency Framework for Paris Rulebook. Paris Rulebook, the INDC, you needed to be transparent. Even in global stocktake, you needed to be transparent. NDC accounting rules, global stocktake modalities, that was being finalized. Just like Prior to Kyoto, you had multiple years of finalizing the rules. Similar was the time taken for finalizing of Paris Agreement as well. IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, what needs to be done by the various countries in order to restrict the warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius, that was accepted. Now, this is where it was highlighted that urgent action needs to be taken, right? Turn Paris Agreement into an operational system. Now, here, some of the organizations which were basically arrived at. That is Powering Past Coal Alliance, right? PPCA. So this was launched earlier in 2017 itself, but major expansion happened at Katowice. So cities, regions, investors, the goal to phase out unabated coal power, right? Demonstrated subnational leadership, even if the national governments are not aligned. And this became important and prominent when you had US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. So multiple states of US, they said that even if Donald Trump doesn't agree, as a state, we will do, or as a company, we are responsible for climate. So we will basically take our own actions, we will take our own measures in the fight against climate change. Now, then COP25, Chile's presidency, the COP happened in Madrid, in Spain. So the focus of the negotiation was Article 6. Article 6, which talked about the utility of the carbon markets, right? Because you basically needed to have the emission trading, etc., to continue, and the developed nations were not on the same page in this. So that is where the negotiations did fail in this. Okay. Now, pre 2020 ambition and loss and damage was also something which was discussed. So, Chile Madrid time for action declaration, enhanced focus on loss and damage fund. And that is where major actions were not taken, major decisions were not arrived at this conference of party. Here, however, Climate Ambition Alliance, that was arrived at. Again, important for your prelims. Okay. Climate Ambition Alliance was arrived at. So here, the goal was net zero emissions by 20. Various groupings they came together and they kept the ambition alive despite any lack of any outcome from the COP25. Because they were seeing that there's a political deadlock in terms of negotiation for Article 6. There is no major action which is being attained. There is no major outcome which is being attained at the COP25. Article 6 is held in abeyance. So no countries are ready to negotiate anymore. So that is why some of the cities, the companies, the non-state actors, they basically got together to commit for net zero emission of 2025, 2050. Then, after the Paris Agreement, possibly one of the most important conference of parties held to date was the post-COVID period Conference of Parties number 26, which was held in Glasgow in UK. This was held in December 2021. By this point of time, the world had almost had 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. India as a country had overachieved its nationally determined contribution. So India expected a pat on its back. Whereas major economies, major global economies like the US, etc., they had floundered, right? They had not met the ambition. So that is where India was met with a surprise. Now, prior to this 2021 meet, there was a flurry of global leaders, European and American leaders into India. Joe Biden had come into power. US again became a part of the Paris Agreement. And by this point of time, multiple different Democrat leaders from US, from UK, all of them were coming to India to convince India that do declare 2050 as your net zero ambition, net zero target. Now, India was taken by surprise because India thought that when it came to Paris Agreement, INDC were the key focus. But because the other countries had not achieved their INDC standards, that is where they shifted the goal. But India held firm. And few days before this, China had declared its ambition that we will be carbon neutral or net zero emission we will achieve by 2060. So the world leaders were pressuring India that look, China is a different case altogether. You are a democracy. So you say 2050, that will be a kind of a win win for everyone. They wanted to save face and they wanted to show that we are the ones who have convinced India. But India said that we will basically become carbon neutral or net zero emission by 2070. Okay, because we need to take care of the poorer population. That angered the Western world such an extent. A host of articles, paid articles, etc., were written about how India is a burden to the developing world, how India will get trapped in the middle income economy, how India is a failed democracy, and so on and so forth. Right? So, in this Glasgow, you had various outcomes. The Glasgow Climate Pact. Now, first ever UN decision to mention coal, phase down of coal, call to revisit and strengthen NDC by 2022. Article 6 was now finalized. What was not finalized or negotiated in Madrid, this was finalized in Glasgow. India declared the Panchamrit mission. What was the Panchamrit mission? Reach non fossil fuel energy capacity of 500 gigawatts by 2030. Fulfill 50% energy requirements via renewable energy by 2030. Reduce 1 billion carbon emissions by 2030. Reduce carbon intensity of the GDP below 45% by 2030 and achieve net zero status by 20. These were the Panchamrit goals. This was asked in the mains examination that year as well. And even in 2025, this had been asked in the mains examination. So that is how major these ambitions and the goal declaration by India has been. Okay. Now, major side initiatives, global methane pledge was arrived at. In order to reduce the methane emissions by 30%, India is not a party to it. US, EU, etc., they were a part of it. Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use and Coalition for Net Zero. European nations became a part of Coalition for Net Zero. So, what each of them are? Global Methane Pledge. It was launched at Conference of Parties number 26 by the US and the EU. Now, this entire conference of parties was held in December. US and EU, they had started discussing about the global methane pledge from September itself. India was not made a party to those initial discussions. India was informed about it in December and was asked to become a party to the global methane pledge. Now, methane emissions, the emissions were being targeted, that was from agriculture, energy, and waste. Now, India's agricultural sector is very sensitive, politically also, and overall for the economy also. So that is why India said we are not going to be a part of this kind of methane emission pledge, right? But what is the global methane pledge? Participating countries committed to reduce the methane emissions by at least 30% from 2020 levels by the year 2030. Methane, what is it? Short lived gas, we have discussed, but it is very potent in terms of global. Coalition for net zero. So basically, this was after China had said we will achieve net zero by 2060. India had said we will achieve net zero by 2070. So UN backed alliance operating under the Race to Zero campaign. I will tell you what is Race to Zero campaign as well. Right? It brings together countries, cities, companies, investors, banks, etc. to achieve that net zero by 2050 or if possible even earlier. So, participation, national governments would pledge economy wide net zero targets, right? Initiatives like C40 cities. Now, this is a grouping of the mayors of the 40 cities across the globe in order to reduce the emission and in order to have their own independent fight against climate change via alliances aligned with science based target initiative and financing through platforms such as GFANS, that is Glasgow financial alliance for net zero? This was also asked in the prelims exam. So, what I'm trying to indicate to you that not just the major outcomes, but even these side outcomes, these side alliances, they are important for your prelims exam as well. Now, race to zero. Now, this includes cities, regions, commitment to achieve net zero by 2050, transparency in climate action, and covers roughly 90% of the global GDP. Race to resilience, climate adaptation, right? The aim to make 4 billion people resilient against climate change by 2030 and counterbalance the mitigation heavy, right? Then you had GIFANS, that is Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, consists of banks, insurers, and asset managers to provide financing to achieve net zero. The entire Glasgow Conference of Party revolved around the net zero mechanism, align trillions of dollars with net zero pathways. However, many different companies, there were allegations that even oil producing companies, they were basically aligning with this target, and there were greenwashing concerns. What is greenwashing? That you are doing something in order to hide the climate damaging activities that you have been doing. So that greenwashing, that was something which was apparent by many of the countries. Okay. Then after that, you had another LND, that is the loss and damage COP, that was COP 27, which was held in the resort town of Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt in 2022. So here, loss and damage fund, which had the discussion of it had started in Warsaw, that loss and damage fund was finally agreed, was arrived at. So recognition that climate impacts require dedicated finance, because by this point of time, you had the historic floods which had occurred in areas of the subcontinent. Lot of typhoons had occurred in the region of the Pacific and the region of the Western Pacific. So they were suffering already. So that is where loss and damage was basically agreed upon. It was still not operationalized, it was agreed upon. Sharm el Sheikh Implementation Plan, Transitional Committee to Operationalize Loss and Damage Fund. Okay, so this is the broader summary of the important COPs up till 2022, starting with 1992, first COP in 1995, Kyoto Protocol in 1997. Kyoto Protocol came into effect in 2005. Now, Canada withdrew in 2011, Paris Agreement in 2015. Paris Agreement then comes into effect 2021 Glasgow and 2022. Okay? Then Sharm el Sheikh adaptation agenda. So governments and the cities, along with the NGOs, they worked with that adaptation in terms of the food security, water availability, health requirements, infrastructure, and also in terms of adaptation delivery. So that was the Sharm el Sheikh adaptation agenda. Now, at the sideline of this Sharm el Sheikh itself, another organization was created. And that was created, championed by UAE. I will write it here. Championed by UAE and Indonesia. And that was Mangrove Alliance for Climate. For Climate. MAC. Post COP 27, initiated by UAE and Indonesia to bring coastal resilience, and also increased green cover. India is also a member, is a member. Now, why was it being done? Because the next conference of parties would be hosted by UAE. The Conference of Parties number 28 was hosted by UAE and Dubai. This was controversial because UAE, an oil producing nation, and that is where fight against climate change is basically fight against the use of fossil fuel, isn't it? So here, first global stocktake, the discussion was concluded. It was recognized that the world is extremely away from achieving 1.5 degrees Celsius requirement, call to transition away from the fossil fuels, right? Operationalization of loss and damage fund was done here. Countries like Japan, they committed to this, committed the fund. Like Japan pledged support. Okay. Then energy transition and renewable capacity pledges. And here, a link was made for the first time between climate change and the impact on health. How climate change is impacting health of the normal population, of the common population for the first time. That linkage was done at Conference of Parties number 28, which was held in Dubai. Now, here, non state actor accountability framework, NSAAF, that was arrived at, push to align voluntary pledges based on science based targets and addresses gap in terms of corporate accountability. Then coming to Conference of Parties number 29, which was held in Baku, Azerbaijan, again an oil producing region. And this is where the greenwashing concerns became louder. Now, in this particular case, NCQG, new collective quantified goal of mobilizing huge amount of fund was agreed upon, replacing the $100 billion goal with a larger amount of funding. But then again, modalities were not discussed. Greater emphasis on adaptation finance. Now, here, the discussion has started on what to do after 2025. Now, obviously, global stock take was something which was not done comprehensively. So, what to do after 2025? That is from next year. But again, US had withdrawn. There was discussion in 2024 that Donald Trump is going to come into power. So, at this point of time, already the developed nations were hesitant to commit to any kind of future funding. Then, the most recent conference of party that was held in November 2025, that was held in Belém in Brazil. So, tripling of adaptation finance compared to 2025 levels. Just transition of energy, focus, diverse national pathways. That and this is where countries like India, they advocated that look, what Germany's pathway or UK's pathway for fight against climate change would be, India and Nigeria's pathway would be very different because the requirement is very different. Okay. So sustainable fuels were in focus. Tropical Forest Forever facility. Now we have done a very detailed video on Conference of Parties number 30, the key outcomes, and also what India did. So the link for that will be provided in the description. You can check it out also. Now, Tropical Forest Forever facility. This is basically a new innovative mechanism where you will basically have the tropical countries, equatorial countries, and tropical countries being paid for the forest upkeep because clearly Red Plus campaign has also not worked and succeeded to that extent. And the money which would be paid would be roughly around $4 per hectare per year, right? Baku to Belém roadmap in terms of galvanizing of the finances were discussed, and Belém declaration on global green industrialization was done. For sustainable fuel, this was something which was also co-sponsored by India. That is where Belém Forex initiative was arrived at. What was this? Countries committed to quadruple the use of sustainable fuels like synthetic fuels, biofuels, hydrogen, green methane, etc. Quadruple means make it four times by the year 2035 as compared to the 2024 levels. Okay. And this pledge would include future fuel action plan. Till now, it has been endorsed by 23 countries. Okay. So when it comes to Belém, two of the initiatives that you need to retain is Tropical Forest Forever Facility and the Belém X initiative. These are the two initiatives that you need to retain. They are important both for your prelims as well as for your mains exam. Okay. And this is basically the summarization of the Conference of Parties from 2015 all the way till 2025. So here you will find that Loss and Damage Fund, Conference of Parties number 27, Sharm el Sheikh. The Paris Rule Book was something discussed in COP 24. So, like that, you have in Conference of Parties number 29 in Baku, the new climate quantified goal. Okay. So, that basically brings us to the end of the discussion now. Now, what have we discussed? The entire history of all the Conference of Parties from Berlin to Belém. And we have discussed the key pointers, major outcomes. Okay. Now, whatever has been the discussion, just ensure that you are up to date with this. And that is all that you need to know, be it for the prelims, be it for the mains examination, be it for 2026, or be it for 2027. I hope this has been valuable for your preparation. If you have liked the content, don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. And do let us know about your opinion of the content in the comment section below. Till we meet again, do take care of yourself and wishing you guys in advance a very happy new year. Thank you and goodbye.